This is the Global Cartel finale. I don't know what happened yesterday with that recording on the Global Cartel. Along in there, my microphone quit for some reason. I have no idea. It's a brand new microphone. Anyway, here we go. I'm going to pick up again at 1933 when the Jews declared war on Germany with their global boycott on German products. And I mentioned a picture online of a New York Times article under the byline of Samuel Untermeyer, that old guy again. And it was a declaration of war against Germany in 1933. And that is what probably triggered Kristallnacht. It triggered the formation of the work camps that Hitler imposed on Germany. I mentioned a lot of those German leaders, including Hitler, were probably trained by MI6 at Tavistock in London. How much of that is really true or not that has recently come out on the internet that I've seen. But we do know that Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, and Goering were both Pharisees, Judeo-Pharisees, and there were supposedly 150,000 Judeo-Pharisees in Hitler's armies, which I've never seen anywhere else before, online. So that is where the work camps started. They were not death camps, they were work camps. Just like FDR's work camps on the West Coast with the Japanese Nisei after the declaration of war against Japan. They were not death camps either, and nor were the death camps or the work camps in Germany. You can see over the entrance to Dachau and the entrance to Auschwitz pictures that say above the entrance, Arbeit macht frei, which literally means work makes free, labor liberates. They were work camps. There were no gas chambers in those camps until after the war, built by the Russians. They were work camps. The Red Cross, you can find some of this online. The Red Cross records are there that I saw the other day, indicates that approximately 261,000 total people died in the camps in Germany during World War II. About 60,000 Pharisees, Judeo-Pharisees at Auschwitz. I saw years ago the records that came out of the Russian archives. They had taken the German records back to Moscow after the war and put them in the Russian archives. There was a site online that indicated that about 61,000 Pharisees had died at Auschwitz during the war. Only 117 were executed. The main killer of the Pharisees in the work camps were the Allies. The Allied bombing campaigns against the railroads, the highways, all the means of getting medicines and food into the camps. Now, it looked like after the war that all these people had starved to death. But also there's another thing that happened when the Germans brought Polish and Russian POWs into those camps. Those POWs brought typhus into the camps as well. And typhus, anybody that dies of typhus looks like they starve to death as well. It just wastes them away. So a combination of factors killed all those people in the camps, and it was not the Germans. The Allies did more killing than the Germans did. Plus, there is evidence that the Pharisees, the Judeo-Pharisees, could have been ransomed away from the Germans any time during the war. For example, Rabbi Michael Dove or Ber Weissmandel and the 50,000 Romanian Jews who were supposed to be carted off to the camps. Weissmandel's people bribed the corrupt German soldiers, officers, to let the Pharisees alone. The Jews themselves raised $25,000, and Weissmandel wrote to the Joint Committee on the Welfare of Jews in Europe, overseen by one Sally, S-A-L-Y, Meyer, who was a Rothschild flunky. The Joint refused the $25,000 that Weissmandel needed for the corrupt German officers, and the Germans hauled them off to the work camps. And Weissmandel wrote back to them saying that you are insane. And after the war, Weissmandel continued his arguments against the Jewish leaders, the Pharisee leaders, who had refused any aid that would have worked to ransom the Jews out of Germany, because Hitler didn't want them there. And there is no record, according to David Irving, that there was any order ever from the German high command or Hitler himself indicating that the Jews, Pharisees, were to be executed and cremated in the camps. And like I say, the evidence shows that there were no crematoria in Auschwitz that would take care of 6 million Jews. If you really stop and think about it and divide the 6 million Jews by how many days there were in the war, how many Jews would have had to been executed every day, it was simply impossible. It just could not be done. The invention of the Holocaust is post-war. Neither Eisenhower nor Churchill nor anybody else in authority at that time mentions a Holocaust of the Judeo-Pharisees in Germany. Period. Okay, we come up to about 1940. The war's going on in Europe because the Brits would not agree to stop the war, and Hitler didn't want any people. Hitler didn't want any war against Britain. At Dunkirk, he did not allow the Germans to attack, and they could have wiped out the force right there. They could have wiped the Brits out right there, and he did not allow it. But Churchill and the Judeo-Pharisees who put him into office wanted a war against Germany. Remember, 1517, Luther. Remember, 1540, Jesuits. Jesuit interference in politics since then. They wanted Germany dead. Never to forget, never to forgive. Remember that as well, because it happens elsewhere in history. It happened in Russia. Russia supported the colonies a couple of times against the Brits, and the Brits never forgot it, and the Jews never forgave it. And so we had the Russian Revolution and all the stalags and the killings and that went on under Stalin, for example. Something like 40 to 50 to 60 million, depending on who you read. Ditto with Mao Zedong in China, which we'll probably get to. Millions. FDR's Pearl Harbor scam was to get America into the war on the Brit side. That was his job. You can read Day of Deceit by Robert Stinnett, who wrote that book based on 20 years of research, he said. You can hear it at YouTube. There's a presentation there reading out Day of Deceit by Robert Stinnett that will tell you everything and more that I would say here. The Japanese were lured into attacking Pearl Harbor, and with the listening stations all around the Pacific Islands and the breaking of the Japanese code in Washington, FDR and his henchmen knew what the Japanese were thinking, what they were doing, where they were before they even attacked. And he did not inform his commanders in Pearl Harbor that they were coming. He wanted that attack to occur because it would give him plenty of excuse to get the U.S. into that war on the Brit side. Treason, I would think it would be called. He was indeed a cripple, not just in his legs from polio, but crippled in his brain. Okay, we got the Holocaust, supposedly, the Holohoax it's mainly called, because it was a hoax. It was invented by the Judeo-Pharisees after the war. Primarily, I think, to show the Jews as victims when they were not, and to increase support for a Jewish homeland, so-called, in Palestine, which Rothschild had connived at getting. There was no Holocaust in Germany. The figures prove it. Oh, and we could go on and say something about Auschwitz. Auschwitz was really a paradise for a lot of those Judeo-Pharisees. There were art classes I've read, orchestral evenings, plays put on, soccer fields, swimming pools. Hell, it was even a whorehouse. Holocaust indeed. Then there's Eisenhower's death camps, which, Eisenhower was called the terrible Swedish Jew in his 1914 annual at West Point. He hated the Germans, excuse me. I hate the Germans, he once declared in the open. And he was not any sort of combat commander. He never commanded troops anywhere in the States until 1914, or 1940, excuse me, when he was a commander of an army camp down in Texas. He was a policy wonk, a staff officer all his career until 1940. MacArthur called him one time either the best staff officer I ever had or the worst staff officer I ever saw. So take your pick. I've seen both quotes. So Eisenhower was made a general very quickly. He went to 5 stars by the end of the war. Passed over many other more fitting combat commanders to become the commander of Allied forces in Europe, because he was supported by Bernard Baruch, for one thing, whom he had met in the 30s, and he was appointed by FDR, by Roosevelt, to be the commander-in-chief in Europe. And Marshall, another Judeo-Pharisee, was the whatever you call it, whatever they call it, chief of staff in the army under Roosevelt. So we go on down. Oh, the camps killed. What Eisenhower did was to round up civilians from age 6 to 80, and some surrendered German soldiers, put them outdoors in open fields under barbed wire, guarded by American soldiers, and allowed to die. They were fed something like 400 calories per day, and they died from starvation and exposure and illness and everything else. It's estimated anywhere from 2 million to 9 million. They're the figures I've seen. (1945), Japan and the atom bombs. There was no need for those bombs to be dropped, none whatever, because Japan was ready to surrender. Also, FDR had received letters of protest not only from Einstein and the scientists who built the thing, but also from senior officers, Army and military officers, let's put it that way, not to drop it. And he went and did it anyway, because he was a crypto Jew, I would call him. He was, I don't have any doubts that he was Judeo-Pharisee just by the name and by his background. So that bomb was not dropped. Those bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima were not necessary to end the war. They were tests. They were nuclear tests, just like at Trinity website, or Trinity site in Alamogordo, New Mexico. I am become death, Oppenheimer repeatedly said when he saw the explosion there. I am the destroyer of worlds. He certainly was. But he was a commie, and it came out later that he was. And we get down to after the war, the UN, which is the cartel's legislative body, global legislative body. All of those people are appointed by their governors, by their governments, who are owned by the cartel. So only approved flunkies, owner-approved flunkies, I call them, oafs, go to the UN. Ike himself was sheep-dipped as president of Columbia University and then put into the presidency. I will go to Korea, and he supposedly ended the Korean War there with a armistice that still goes on today. It did not end the war. It ended the fighting, but it did not end the war. And then you get into all of these other flunkies, from JFK to LBJ and on up the line, all of them. If you're not approved by the cartel, you do not become president. And that's why Trump can say that he is the chosen one, not just because of being chosen preparatory Antichrist by the Sanhedrin or the Prince of Peace by the Israel Heritage Foundation. He is the chosen one, chosen by the cartel to destroy the West and the U.S. and bring us into the New World Order, where you will be happy and own nothing and will eat bugs. Now the time for the reset is now. It's coming and is here now. It has been going on. It has only lacked means of control, and now the tech bros have given them that. Got Palantir under Teal. Vance is Teal's bitch. And we have Sugar Baby. We have Musk. All of those guys are Pharisees, Judeo-Pharisees, killers, one and all, Antichrist, Satan worshipers. And what they are doing is making artificial intelligence the Antichrist. I don't accept anymore that the Antichrist is going to be a man, or definitely not a woman, because of the way that the Pharisees see woman. Ladies, if you want to know how you are viewed by your owners, look at Shabbat 152a in the Babylonian Talmud. You can get another very good view by looking at the website Judaism.is. At archive.org, you'll have to go back. I found it again at under 2020, year 2020, because it is not on the net now. But you can find it in the archive, and it will tell you exactly how your owners, our owners, see women. Don't blame me. Okay, so I believe that now artificial intelligence is the Antichrist. And once those guys put all of those chatbots together, unify them into one overarching AI, that will do them away as well. Those guys have no clue what they're doing. They don't have a clue what their owner and master, Satan, Lucifer, the devil, has in store for them. I have mentioned this other places, but I don't think anybody really believes it. Satan, Lucifer, according to the only man I ever saw say this, wants, his chief desire is the extermination of the life force from the earth. And that is a direct quote that I wrote down years ago. They don't understand that they are committing suicide and murdering the rest of the people. Okay, we come to the Jesuits. The Roman Jesuit Church, I call it now, because the Jesuits have controlled the church for centuries. Okay, we go back to the Papal Bull of 1450. I regard modern history as beginning in 1450 with that Papal Bull, because it essentially said pagan countries are to be conquered and pagan peoples enslaved forever. And that's what they're doing. And that's where we are. 1492, the Edict of Expulsion from Spain. That was an edict put out by the King and Queen, Isabella and Ferdinand, that all Pharisees had to convert to Catholicism or get out. And that extended later to Portugal. And many of the Pharisees left. They fled back into the Eastern Europe and into Western Europe, into the Eastern Mediterranean and so on. But the Pharisees who converted and continued to practice Judaism in private, the Spaniards call them Marranos, politely conversos, but I call them Marranos because that's what they are. Marrano turns out to be the Spanish slang for pig. Certainly proper, don't you think? Okay. So we come down to 1517. Oh, let's talk about Christopher Columbus, or Francisco Zarco. Curameo Ahau calls him in one of his videos at YouTube that you can see. Columbus Zarco was not Italian. He did not come out of Genoa. He was a Spanish Marrano, the illegitimate son of a Spanish prince and his Pharisee mistress. So he had entrance into the courts and with wealthy Pharisees who employed him more so than Isabel and Ferdinand to look for a new Jewish homeland in the New World. And that's really what he set out to do. And so in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, blah, blah, blah. Now, Zarco never spoke Italian, from what Mr. Ahau says, and I would probably concur with that personally. Years ago, when I was a merchant marine cadet, we docked in Genoa, we called it, because that's the European headquarters of the company that I was sailing with. Anyway, at that time, I used to walk around cities I'd never been in just to familiarize myself with it, the streets, the layout, the feel, the vibe. And I was walking down this street in Genoa, just in a kind of a suburban setting. And just a quiet, middle-class neighborhood, it looked like to me. Clean, quiet, hardly anybody on the street. And I came up on this black iron fence, chipped, rusting, needing, maintenance and repainting. The yard was overgrown. Some of the weeds were probably knee-high. The house was in disrepair. It needed a new roof and definitely needed a new paint job, if nothing else. And it kind of struck me as funny because of the neighborhood. And I walked on up to the gate, and there was a sign there that said it was the birthplace of Christopher Columbus. And that was a little bit of a shock. If Christopher Columbus grew up in Genoa, his birthplace would not look like a pigsty, which it did. So I can lend a bit of personal credence to the fact that Columbus was not Italian. Okay, we go on. 1517, Luther's posting of his theses at Wittenberg, the start of the Protestant Reformation. He really did not mean to break up the church. That was not his intent. He just wanted some reformation of the church itself. and the Pope and all the other prelates and dignitaries didn't want that. Because the church was then a dictatorship and not of the proletariat. So that was the start of the Reformation. 1519, Cortez and his troops go ashore in Veracruz and begin the conquest of the Aztecs and Mexico. 1521 is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. There was an earlier one down in Jamestown, Virginia. That one at Roanoke disappeared. 1534. That is the date. 1534 Paris. That was when the Jesuit order was founded by Marranos. Mostly. I've read of 9 Marranos and 4 Gentiles who created the Jesuit order. And in 1540, the Pope himself approved the Jesuits as the Pope's Marines. I've also heard them called the Pope's CIA, and so on. 1549, at the Council of Trent, the Jesuits dominated it, and there was one who became the first secretary of the Jesuit order, a Lanez, whatever his name was, something like that, who dominated the council then, and it went on for years. And that's when the Jesuits really moved up in the church. The Jesuit monks swear total loyalty to the Black Pope, he's called. That's what I'll call him. Director General, whatever. And they are committed to the death to the order. So the Jesuit monks spread out through the world. They went into the New World, into South America, into the Caribbean, into Mexico, and forced enslavement on the population, tried to get them working on the plantations, the sugar plantations primarily to start, that the Spaniards started. But the Indians were not very good at working the field. They weren't very good slaves at all. So they began to look around for others. And we all know what happened there. Anyway, we'll go on. So the Jesuits forced slavery. They forced conversion to the church. They infiltrated every agency of education and politics and the courts in the North and South America, in India and China and Russia, everywhere in the world. And so today, Biden was a Jesuit. Opus Dei is Jesuit Light, I call it. SCOTUS, there's the last figure I saw was 4 or 5 Catholics, supposedly, probably Jesuits, Jesuit trained, on the Supreme Court. Frankie the Fake, he was called. Francis, Pope Francis, is now dead. He was a Jesuit, came out of South America. The president of Argentina now is a Jesuit, from what I understand. Now, Leo the 14th is an Augustinian, I understand. And it looks like early on he's going bricks. He is abandoning the West and going south and bricks. Because most of his career was spent in South America, Peru, I remember reading, with the poor in Peru. But from everything I read, which is not a whole lot, I must admit, the Augustinians are Jesuit light. The thing about Jesuits too in politics, Stalin was a Jesuit priest in the Soviet Union. And the Lord only knows how many people he had murdered. Chairman Mao was trained in Moscow at the time and Jesuit sponsored in China, along with the Brits probably, and later Kissinger, of course. That means Rothschild. He was a Jesuit. Castro in Cuba was a Jesuit, and he was sponsored by the CIA up in the mountains before they came down and really ran old Batista out. So it's ongoing. All of their shenanigans are ongoing today. The European royal family is the third branch of the Global Cartel, and they've been involved with the Rothschilds, as we have seen, since the mid-1700s at least. William, the next King of England, Scotland, Ireland, blah, 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 is a Rothschild. Lady Di was a Rothschild, and so was her mother. So there are the three branches of the Global Cartel laid out for you, and you can see why we're in deep doo-doo. Because the Pharisees despise Gentiles, and it is a duty, a mitzvah, to kill them. We overcome the Gentiles with subterfuge. And we can see that Trump, Putin, Zelensky, Netanyahu are all Pharisees. Trump, Putin, and Zelensky are Chabad Lubavitch, just like Trump. The same thing goes for Peter Thiel, Musk, Sugar Baby, Michael Dell, Ellison at Oracle, on and on and on. And probably Gates is probably a crypto Jew. Paul Allen certainly was Jewish, from everything I read. Anyway, there you have it. The Global Cartel. Do with it as you like. Goodbye for now. May God have mercy on us all.